Erin. How you doing?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Um, the first, pretty much the first question I have is a twofold question. Like the first half is, where are you located on this shiny planet, and the second one, and how has been the pandemic going for you so far?
I am in Portland, Oregon at the moment, and the pandemic has been very interesting. Clearly, there's a lot of divisiveness going on in the world. And for me, I've always seen it as a way for people to wake up and see what's going on in our world, not in a, not that people are unawake intentionally. It's just that sometimes it takes crisis for us to recognize that change is the thing that's going to make us feel better, even though we're totally resistant to it. So for me, the pandemic, I think, has been just another opportunity for us to go, okay, pause for a minute. Let's see what's going on and figure out a way to navigate it in a way that feels good.
The One of the reason why I do ask this, being sober myself for a few years, I do have heard that like there was a rise in relapses, in anxiety attacks, in depression, and even suicide. Um, have you felt or heard or seen um, stuff to that effect? Like happening around you?
I do know that the suicide rate has gone up, and that doesn't surprise me at all. I think that I have very different views of suicide. I you know, and I don't need to share those on here, but I think that a lot of people are just on the verge of not feeling super great, and then when you mix in something like a pandemic, that the piece of the pandemic that I think is the most challenging for people is death, right? Because that's the thing that we all pretend is not happening on a regular basis. Like, because we would live our life very differently if we, recognize that we aren't guaranteed anything beyond this moment. There'd be very different choices made, there'd be a very different perspective, but we walk around and pretend like we have all the time in the world. The thing about death that's so challenging for people is that it's the unknown. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. And us humans, we want to know, like, what causes the majority of our upset is trying to control the uncontrollable, people, circumstances, outcomes, events, us needing them to show up a certain way. Otherwise, we reserve the right to feel bad. And death is like the one thing that there just is no, I mean, there are people that have died and come back and they tell interesting stories, and some of them very similar. And we still just don't know all the things. And so without knowing that, that's kind of the biggest deal for us, is we think we want to control and are controlling everything in our lives. And that's the uncontrollable. There's no way to get around it because we just don't know what happens.
And do you feel that the pandemic has played on, like, so you attribute this to the fear of death, or you attribute this to because like some would argue that, and I'm not necessarily one of them, but like some would argue that um we're talking about like a pretty rough and tough cold, rather than like a mortal virus, or a deadly virus running around, like,
Oh,
so.
yeah. No, I'm not commenting on the reality of what's happened. I'm commenting
Okay.
on the fear mongering that's been going on in media, and, right, the fear
Absolutely.
state that's been created through this whole thing is what's driving suicides, relapses, anxiety, mental health issues. It's the fear of that's driving it. It's, I don't, I'm not a frontline worker. I don't know exactly. I've studied a lot of different doctors and different things around all of that to try to understand it in a way that's meaningful for me. And I wouldn't begin to tell anybody else what is meaningful for them. I just know that mass media loves to play on fear because fear sells.
Yeah.
And getting people into a state of fear over something that's already fearful that we try to avoid talking about, thinking about, just created a perfect storm of things for a lot of people that were on the edge. It was just, this was the last thing, right? I
And
know
it
personally many people that had mental health issues that went away to rehabs for mental health and drugs and alcohol. And I mean, it was just the final thing, right? They were already
yeah.
on the edge. It was the thing that sent him that direction.
And it probably is the, like, above everything, like the biggest blame is the media handling it. Right, like, either they were right or wrong. It's the handling of the information. As you say, like the kind of the motor, the engine of it all, I guess is fear fueled. And it's always like the extremes, like there can't be just an objective news um broadcast. It has to be spectacular, so
And I
and
would also say it seems like, I don't know how old you are. I'm 51. When I was growing up, when we watched the news was information. It didn't
yep,
have a political slant on it. It was just, here's
opinions,
what's
yeah,
going on in the world. And now it feels like everything's an opinion piece with
yeah,
some sort of agenda laden, whatever behind it. And this is a problem. This is something that's happening that I'm hoping that a lot of people will wake up from getting out of this fear to recognizing that it's not as divided out there as we all are experiencing. It's actually closer together than we think, just like humans in general. I don't think I'm over speaking here, but I think that as humans, we spend an awful lot of time trying to delineate out our side or our person or whatever from another person. And the reality is we are so much more alike than different. We may have different political ideals or things like that, but in terms of humanity, we want to be loved. We want to love others, especially those that are nearest to us. And we want to have deep, meaningful relationships with people. Like that's the thing. That's not a political thing. That's just a humanity thing. And if we can remember that in the midst of all the politics and the pandemic and whatever the next crisis is going to be, because there will be another one after this. This isn't the end, and that's why I work with people on these things, because most people think that these things are external things. I'm in fear because of the pandemic. I'm in fear because of whatever. The reality is that fear lives inside of you. And it's just that the pandemic is bringing it out.
yeah,
And so if we continue to think that outside of us is what's causing our experience, then it's very challenging to fix that because we can't control people and circumstances. But what we can control is our uh, emotional experience, and knowing that. That's what I help people recognize is, if I can control my emotional experience, then I don't have to go down that track of fear. Are there some things to be fearful of? I guess. And if we understand how to navigate them in a way that's meaningful to us, then we don't have to have such an awful experience with it. We can understand where it comes from, what it's about, and use that in a positive way. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And you decide to open the TV and get kind of swallowed by that opinion based news broadcast, right? Like you decide to not change a channel, which was like probably my biggest mistake when that old shit hit the fan, right? Like it was, like just being on on the TV, um quarantined and just 24/7 looking at the stats and the numbers grow and actually like just losing my mind, like just like what the hell, like it was so almost hypnotic, um but it was me, like it was me, um stuck there, and I had to voluntarily change the channel, or shut it down, power it off completely, and just stop listening to it because it was driving me nuts. And I think you're right. Like it's the reaction to it. Um, there's definitely a part of that is, um, like you said, like media have changed so much, but when you acknowledge that we've lost a lot of objectivity in reporting the news, and we have turned more on the what's your opinion, and what kind of the next vox populi of like asking people on the street what they think about the news
Hmm.
more than the news itself. um it's now on us to, as human being, like acknowledge it and decide how we deal, especially if we deal badly with it, like to just turn off the friggin' TV, again, and listen to music, or a book, so, or my podcast.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, I think I haven't watched the news, like mass media news for over a decade because I recognize that I was having a visceral response to the news. And this is, you know, obviously a decade ago, that's mid 2000s. Um, I was like, I couldn't figure out why I felt low. And it was after I watched the news, I would take in all of that information and it would make me feel awful. And I thought, wow, it took me a while to whittle down that that was the thing. And I know there are people out there that think that, not watching the news is irresponsible. And I would say that what's irresponsible to me, or not irresponsible, but less enjoyable, is not enjoying my life, not recognizing that something doesn't feel good. And it's not that I'm in denial. I can watch it now and it's no problem. But I had some healing I needed to do around taking in information in that way. And I think there's a lot of people now that are going to have that healing that they need to do because I think people are starting to recognize that it doesn't feel good. And like you said, turning off when you need to turn off, get information if you need to, and then turn it off and don't just have it running in the background and, over and over and over again, hearing these things because on a subconscious mind level, the subconscious mind can't decipher whether something is happening over and over again or it's happening for the first time. It can't decipher if you're talking about something or seeing something over and over again, whether that's happening over and over again. So like your body is experiencing that over and over again. So if you're watching that, you can turn on a news channel and they'll just have a news loop, right? And they just tell the same sort of stories again and again. And your body is experiencing it new each time as though they hadn't heard it before because your subconscious mind can't tell the difference between it just happening now and having happened in the past and you getting the information again.
So it actually just adds it up.
Yeah. So that's how and the reason I discovered that is because I had an anxiety disorder, and the anxiety disorder was brought about by talk therapy of all things. It was me telling my trauma story over and over again once a week to a counselor. And I just kept living it over and over again in my mind and my body. And, that mind body connection is real. The thoughts you think create chemistry in your body. And so if you're telling a trauma story over and over again, you're creating that. And then because of the telling of that story and not wanting to acknowledge those emotions, I created anxiety to cover it up. So it was like a defense mechanism to not feel the feelings.
And let's rewind that tape of your story so we get to that um, a bit more in detail. Um, uh, Pretty much every episode would, I start by actually rewinding the life story tape of my guests, and I pretty much I've asked the same question recently to my guests, to pretty much rewind it back to some of that, like of the most um, early event that like would you would describe as an event that defined who you became, like or that like when I talk to drug addicts and alcoholics, like sometimes it's either an experience themselves, like that, like they use for the first time, or like witnessing, I don't know, like my grandfather was mythically over drinking, and and I got impressed by that and whatever, um where would you bring back that memory, Erin?
I think the first like real defining moment was that what I was just talking about was, I went into a counselor with my boyfriend at the time so that we could figure out why we couldn't get along. And in that first session, I had a panic attack, and I'd never had one before, and I didn't know what it was. And,
How old
it
were
was,
you, Erin?
I was 28.
And how long have you been with that boyfriend so
We'd
far?
been
When
together for 7 years, and we had done everything from living together to dating to, on again, off again. We just couldn't work it out, and we clearly loved each other, at least as friends, if not more, and we sought counseling because we just wanted to understand, why we couldn't figure it out. And in that first counseling session, we were in the midst of explaining it to the counselor, and I had a panic attack, and she noticed right away, and she said, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Actually, no." And I started to describe for her that I felt like I couldn't breathe and that I was like 2 inches tall and I was in the corner and all the air was being sucked out of the room. And I felt disoriented and sort of out of body. And she was like, "Yeah, you're having a panic attack." And I was like, "So this happened in 1998, maybe." And, you know, panic attacks was not something that people really talked about. It was kind of, it's certainly not, it's very much more normal now. People will say, "Yeah, I had a panic attack." And most people I know have a lot of anxiety and have had some form of a panic attack. And so from there, she stopped the couple session and asked me if I would be willing and wanted to do some individual work because obviously something was coming up for me. And I agreed to do that. And for the next 9 months, my life became more and more narrow because the panic attacks started happening closer and closer together and more often. And um, I began to get very fearful about just everyday life. I was at the time training for a half marathon and I had a panic attack while I was running. So I stopped running. And I only mention this because it wasn't, the narrowing of your life happens in slow motion. You don't recognize, "Oh, I've just given up this thing." Obviously, we know in terms of mental health that exercising is good for mental health, but I was so afraid after that panic attack, you couldn't have got me out running again if you dragged me, you know? And so what ended up happening is I started to hole myself up in my home because I was so afraid to go out, because my life became narrow, because everything that I was doing, I would have a panic attack doing it. And so then it was like, oh, I guess I can't do that anymore either. Oh, I guess I can't do that anymore. And so then I quit my job because I had a panic attack in front of, I was a teacher at the time, in front of my students. And so I only bring this up because the narrowing of our life happens and we don't recognize it because it happens in slow motion. But I want to bring it up because I know a lot of people, by the time they come to me, are in crisis mode, and many of them were in that position. So it's just a point of awareness. Like, are you narrowing things in your life because they feel uncomfortable? It's not the things. The work is inside. And if we don't go inside to heal that piece, then you're going to give up another thing in your life. And what kind of life is that, to keep giving up things because you're afraid?
So what what was the, kind of therapy about, like when she meets with you one on one, like it's so, like I'm guessing that, you kind of shelf the couple therapy because, like they now focus in on what has caused the panic attack, right?
Yeah.
And what is the, like what is the intent at that point?
So she had said that, the work would be to, start at the beginning basically, and, talk about everything that had happened up until present day. And I think the most shocking part of that was not so much that there was, well, yeah, the most shocking part was that there wasn't any more trauma than I had remembered. I thought once the anxiety started or the panic attack started, that it was covering something up, that there was something like a latent story or an aha, or, something that I had, tamped down so much that I had forgotten it, or, and what I found when I had reached the pinnacle of my anxiety was that there wasn't anything there. It was literally void. And this blew my mind. I thought, how can this be? I had all this anxiety. Why am I having this anxiety when there's nothing on the other side? It took me another 10 years after coming out of that whole experience to recognize why. And it was through studying the brain and understanding the subconscious mind, and realizing that the anxiety was a defense mechanism because I so badly didn't want to feel the feelings that were involved with the trauma that I had experienced. And it doesn't have to be that traumatic. Like, not everybody has some hugely traumatic story. In fact, my story is not so traumatic, but it's less about, all the details. In recovery, I'm sure you've heard some crazy stories about, drug use and alcohol use and the things that we do to cover up what's really going on. The problem is that we are conditioned to not experience our feelings from a very young age. And we've got so conditioned to it that a lot of the time that I spend with clients is helping them understand what emotional awareness is. They don't even know what feelings are. They don't know, they don't have a vocabulary around it, because from a very young age, when you fall over and hurt yourself, you have adults in your life going, "It's okay, honey, don't cry." And so it starts with that, innocently enough. It's not meant to be an awful thing. It's just that we don't want to see other people in pain. But the reality is pain is where healing takes place. And if we don't allow ourselves to have those emotions and feel that pain, it never goes away. It just keeps coming back.
It's it the conversation I've had, with guests so far, like it's, like this podcast is all about, resilience, right? Like it's always about overcoming and at the same time, that this podcast is also about, like people sharing, like people exposing some of the traumas and some of the um, obstacle they had to face in their lives. Like and one of like one of the question that like sometimes this podcast tries to answer is, especially for addiction, um, is it nature or nurture? Um, and I have my own hypothesis, um, behind that, based on my own life experience, um, and therefore, like there's something kind of going a bit, um, not against, but like a bit, in the opposite way of what you're describing, which is like the more I- in my own experience, the more I told some of the stuff that I was ashamed of or that would cause, um, like a painful emotion, the more I shared about it, or at least I shared once with someone I trust and and loved, um, it would the feeling of shame or the feeling of guilt would dissipate. Um, what I do understand from like the story you're telling is that the trauma that you did share with someone, I guess you trusted, actually made the opposite. It created the opposite effect on you.
Yeah, and I know that that flies in the face of most people's experiences, and I'm not against talk therapy. I think it's a lot of what I do with my clients is talk therapy. But talk therapy without healing is just re-experiencing trauma.
Oh, no doubt, absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I do understand that. Well, I think I do understand that part, and like I'm gonna have you kind of elaborate on what is the process of um, treating, like without, like so. Um, how do you make sure that like you're actually trying to not fix, but like treat the trauma itself?
Well, for me, there's a understandings that need to happen behind the scenes in order for you to recognize why you're having the experience you're having. And it looks something like this. I'm going to try and shorten it so that it's not a huge thing. Um, so, as a young child, we have experiences, good and bad. And from those experiences, we decide things. And those decisions shape our rights and our wrongs, what's good and what's bad based on these experiences. And importantly, the story of your life and all the things that happened, it's not it's not so much the things that happened that are important. It's really about what you decided about yourself based on that, right? And most people decide the same things. They decide things like I'm not good enough, I don't deserve, I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable. Distilled down, I believe that is I don't have value. And so here's a child, has all these experiences, not necessarily adults sitting them down and saying things, but they're watching the adults in their lives and seeing, oh, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing, this is a right thing, this is a wrong thing. And so as they're going through that, that's shaping the perspective in which they can see this life. And so they have the experience, feels good, feels bad, decide things about themselves, create a reality around that story of the things, and attach emotions to it. And then they've committed to what's right and wrong through those experiences, right? My parents say that, working hard is a value, right? Or I went to church and they said telling the truth is a value and not telling the truth is a sin, things like that, right? So that's rights and wrongs, goods and bads. And then we commit to those and we commit others to our experiences, right? So if I'm committed to rights and wrongs, goods and bads, and then I commit other people to them. And how this looks is if somebody is doing something that is not within your rights and wrongs or goods and bads, we reserve the right to either judge them, or if they've said something to us and we've gone into reaction, then we can blame them for not following along our rules. But the reality is everybody's having that same experience. And so my the things that happen in my childhood are shaping the perspective that I can see. And from that perspective, I'm creating expectations of people. And so if they don't fit into those expectations, then I judge them or I get to react to them angrily or whatever your go to emotion is. So they said something to me, I get to be upset. But the problem with that scenario is that that gives all the power to everybody and everything because you've given them permission to be in control of your emotions. And so if you allow that to happen, you have no control. And that's why we have stress, anxiety, overwhelm, worry, all these low level experiences because we've given up our power to other people and to circumstances. Are you following me so far?
I am
Okay.
absolutely.
So then somebody says something or an outcome isn't how we want, then we get upset and we blame the thing or the person. And there's no freedom in that. And there's no control in that. And we love to have control, but the only thing we can control is our emotional experience. But we've given that up to circumstances or people. So when you understand that this is what's going on behind the scenes, that this is the underlying issue about all of your experiences, then when you have somebody in front of you that says something that makes you think is making you feel bad, instead of making them wrong, that's the opportunity for us to look inside and go, what's going on with me that I'm in reaction to that person or that circumstance? That's a very different way to go. That's taking personal responsibility for your experiences. Most people are in victim stance where they're like, you made me feel this way. That made me feel this way. And I ask people to do the opposite. I ask them to recognize that you're having an emotional reaction. That's yours to own. And that's your signal that there's something inside that could use some healing based on that story.
Can can you elaborate with an example? You know, like in your case that like like your couple therapy that gets put on hold, and like and then you try. What happens next? You know, like in terms of like your own kind of investigating within you what is going on.
Are you asking me what are the steps to healing, or are you asking me to give you an
Actually,
example of the
just like
process I just talked about?
well, just in terms of like like involving that process in your own um may I say recovery or like
Mhm.
healing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, listen, we're all in recovery. If you think you don't have a story that you're healing from, you just haven't got there yet. It's definitely
Exactly.
there.
Oh,
That's why we're here. We're here to heal and grow. That is the purpose, I believe, of why we exist, is for this healing process. And each of it is individual. So, while there are some similarities and some same feelings, we all had different experiences. And that's why it's crazy making when we think that everybody, we have these expectations of people when they had totally different experiences than us. In terms of, so I'll tell you one of the defining moments for me as a child was my parents getting divorced because my father was kind of my rock, my everything. And when they decided to get divorced, he moved out. And that just sort of obliterated me as a 5-year-old. And I made decisions about myself based on that, those ones that I talked about. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. Like, how could I be lovable? These two people that say they love me the most, I couldn't keep them together because as children, we're egocentric. That means that we believe that we have a hand in everything. Like we are the impetus for this life. And that's a developmental thing. And so if my parents split up, that had to be my fault. There was something about me that made that happen. And that's I mean, you could say that's a spiritual right, like that's why we're here, right? Is to heal these things. And so they happen on purpose. So from there I chose people specific to, to healing. That's what we do is we get into relationship with people who can point out to us where there's healing to take place. And so this gentleman that we went to couples counseling with was that very thing. We'd been together for 7 years, on again, off again. And the reason that we couldn't get along is because we were just hurting each other back and forth, right? And that's what couples often do is they escalate one another's pain by, somebody said this, oh, that hurt my feelings. Oh, yeah. Well, now I'm going to tell you this, right? And they continue to escalate each other. It's not usually that obvious, but they don't recognize that there's hurts happening in the background. And we're, the key word these days is trigger. We're triggering this pain. We're poking at that pain back and forth. And that's how it escalates and you have fights and those sorts of things. And that's what we were doing. And without knowing that, there was no way to get out of it because we were just poking at each other's hurts over and over again, like wounds, literally. Like in terms of healing, I didn't actually learn how to heal myself through that relationship. It wasn't until many years later that I started to recognize what it takes to actually heal. And now I actually work with couples and I show them that that's what's happening when you're escalating one another. You're poking at that story of all the things that happened that didn't feel good um, without even understanding it. But when you understand it, you can do it differently. Because when you understand that you're responsible for your emotional experiences, then when that person said that thing that hurt your feelings are hurt. They didn't hurt them. You had your feelings poked at by that person. They gave you the gift to look at it. And so that becomes a different kind of not getting along thing. It becomes a more responsible way to look at it and go, okay, you said this thing. I don't feel good now. Like you didn't make me feel bad. I don't feel good, which is very different. And then you go, okay, what inside of me can be healed, right? Instead of, I'm going to make you responsible for my feeling bad. I become now responsible for my feeling bad, not in a blame, shame, or fault kind of a way, in a, oh, okay, something to look at and wonder and curiosity way. Why is this happening? Why am I having this experience?
Does so you said that like your couple kind of didn't survive because like that the healing came, or the kind of the reasoning, or the putting words into like the methodology came much later. um was there like looking back, were there like kind of options where like you could associate some of the stuff you did to some of the experience you had, or like that would just like trigger the trauma?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking.
I mean, like looking back, like was this something that like if you had a patient later that or have a patient that like has like kind of a similar story to yours, um could you identify, looking at your story, that if you had yourself as a patient looking back, you'd be able to pinpoint like what was not working in kind of that couple dynamic?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, we kind of have go tos. We like to, for me, it was always like, this isn't working out. I'm out. I was like, this clearly isn't working out. We're arguing or whatever. I don't want to stay. Right. Because if I'm not lovable, I would set up a situation that said that that person can't love me because I'm not lovable. So I would find different ways to make them not love me. Right.
And you probably would be leaving before your quote unquote dad did.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would choose to leave first because
Yeah.
that didn't feel good, right?
Yeah. Being left out felt so bad as a kid.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Oh, I appreciate that you just I'm glad that we went through that because that actually nobody's ever asked me that on a podcast. And I think that's a real world explanation of the things that we don't even recognize are going on. And I think that people can relate to that. So I appreciated that question very much.
Well, like for me, like what's so interesting is the different angles. Like there's something that like I explain a lot, but like here in Quebec, like there's actually pretty much like two ways that like we treat addiction. There's one way which is called in French it's réduction des méfaits, but I always forget the translation of that. But it's actually um, trying to use in a reasonable way, like so I tried that like a year prior to go into therapy, so that gives you how much I appreciate that method. But um so they tried to coach me into like counting my drinks and counting my joints, and like just okay, so have you used last week? Yeah. Were you reasonable? Like, so please help me define reasonable, please. But, and then, like, it was all about, like, could kind of control your use. That's one side of it, which is mostly paid by our public sector agencies. Um, and it's, mostly outside clinics. Um, you visit them and, like, like you get matched with a therapist and so on. And that failed miserably for me. The second option, which is more on the private side, like more therapy center, is pretty much based on almost exclusively on 12-step therapy program. So, all inspired by the AA movement, which, then gave birth to the NA, the CA, and, and so on and so forth. Um, and so like this was for a while, for me it was really the only two ways, and one I absolutely and still don't believe in. And so there was only one way that you could treat addiction, was based on 12 steps. um Not because I'm close minded, because that's the only one I knew. Like it was pretty much like the only um it was pretty much the only angle, like or method I knew. So, like I would never have suspected that there was tons of methods. Like I've heard others, but like for me, like that, like there were, like most of the other ones that I knew, or I say other ones, but like there were very little, but very few, and they weren't working. So um it's by starting that podcast that I started to talk to people that, like would, I don't know, like I always have the same, guest in mind that, like is recovery and sobriety is maintained through, he's from the First Nations. He's, so he does like group drumming and group percussions, and like he maintains in meditation is recovery and sobriety healthy. I've heard therapy based on music. I've heard therapy based on meditation, and therapy based on mostly spirituality more than anything. Um, so for me, it's always like the opening up the perspectives, and like the kind of the um, how wide the options are in treating and observing and actually just make your life better. And for me, it still is, 160 something guests later, so fascinating. Um, your approach is, like something that, like I kind of, not kind of, but based on my own experience. So like, it was almost quite almost the opposite. Like when I'm asked to share at, like at a fraternity meeting, like an AA meeting or an A meeting, it's all about sharing those traumas so that the um slowly, I'd say slowly, not necessarily slowly, because like it 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 involves that beforehand I've diminished the impact it has on me by sharing with my sponsor. So I'll give you, like a super easy example of that, Aaron. So um, I just was separated with my ex, and I had a young daughter and a young son. My daughter was younger, so she may have been, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6. Um, I end up almost an hour drive from my ex, and I have him one weekend on two, so like 4 days a month. Um, that weekend, um, sh- like it's Sunday, so like I will bring him back to their moms after, right before dinner, actually, and I think it's about noon, and I hear my son screaming. And so I go to the living room, and my daughter has bit my son, and quite quite bad. Like so, um, I was actually taught by my own mother that like when a kid starts biting, best way to have him or her stop is to actually bite the kid yourself. So maybe a fucked up, but like it's not, like I've told that story 100 times, and like there were a lot of people that say, I heard that too. Like so, um, maybe less popular in 2021, but I'm 46, and probably way less popular in 2021. But all that to say that that was like the kind of one of my great parent teaching. Like so. I go in the living room, like, what have you done? Blah blah blah, and like I'm how to panic. I I'm not kidding, Aaron. It was like, like just I never, I didn't bite off a chunk of my daughter's hand, right? Like I just like do the biting, and she goes like, meh, and like, but it's an instant, right? Like I didn't even hurt her really, but like you have to picture that, like she's a um porcelain, like that, like she's a blonde with blue eyes. Her skin is like porcelain, right? Like so the very little bite marks that I do marks her skin right there. Like and I start fucking panicking. My relation with my ex is not good, and I know that I'm in deep fucking trouble because I've just bit my daughter out of a, like kind of a parent lesson that my mother gave me, and I'm freaking out. Next thing I know, I start rubbing this with every single things that I found on the internet that told me that it would make a mark on skin disappear. Like so that involves, like kind of, rubbing a penny, rubbing ice, rubbing cucumbers, rubbing vanilla. I try to remember, but I rubbed every fucking thing in my pantry to everything. Like so I would go on Google, remove skin mark, and some say, okay, one teaspoon of vanilla. And so to a point where my daughter, which is probably between, five, maybe 5, 6, she's just like, Dad, like, I'm not hurt anymore. Like you can fucking relax. Like just okay. I'm good. Like I'm good, but I'm crying. Like I'm freaking out. I was right freaking out because like I drive to my parents, I start telling them like I'm in shit, like my ex is gonna just like throw me under the bus for that, and so on and so forth, and everyone's like, relax, like there's nothing wrong, like I mean, well, obviously my mom didn't, was just like, well, that's the way it is, but I knew that she was wrong about that, and so I drive my kids to their moms, and she tells me, so I tell her like in panic, and she must have seen that, like my eyes were just like, I felt like shit, to be honest, Aaron. Like I felt like pure crap. And she she just picks the kids up and turns around and said, "You're just fucking lucky, you piece of shit, that I don't call the police." And she slams the door. So I get back in my car. That's a recent divorce, like it's a recent separation. So every single time I would drop them, I would drop the kids to their moms. My 1 hour drive back home, I would be crying, just crying. I I was actually just like slowly dying of missing them. Like it was awfully bad. Um, and so you can imagine that, like if I was feeling like shit when I dropped them, like when she slammed the door, I felt like pure crap. Like it was really, really bad. So I call my sponsor, and like through the crying, like he pretty much deciphers what the fuck happened, right? Like I'm like just like really, like it must have been really painful to listen. But so I tell him my story, and he's like, okay. Um and his question, I'm not kidding, was actually, "Do you think you're gonna do it again?" I said, "What the fuck do you," like, I gotta stop crying. I'm like, What the fuck do you mean?" Like, "No, I'm just telling you, like, what a piece of shit I am." Like, "No, I'm not gonna bite anyone ever again for that." Like, what, what's that question? Like, and he's like, "Well, you're learning something." Like, so I just, like, I remember hanging up and, like, just like pretty much screaming in my car, "What a freaking dumbass." Like, what kind of question is that? Like, and I was freaking out. Um, Fast forward 2 weeks later, I have from my memory, like nothing outstanding, but like it was just a great weekend with my kids, and and so sure enough, like I dropped them off, and like so my driving back home is actually, like calling my sponsor because I'm gonna cry my eyes out. And the first thing he asked me, he said, "Hey, so have you bit your daughter?" And I'm like, "No, I didn't." Like, what kind of messy question is that? He said, "Well, just to teach you that, like, you've learned a lesson, and I'm not going to make jokes every week about that, but like I just want to, like kind of diminish that, like you've done your mistake, you've learned through it, and like you're good. You can actually tell that story, like not that, like it didn't necessarily mention that I had to share, or I had to, but this story now feels like, um it by sharing it with him, I got rid of the guilt associated with that story. Um, and fun fact, like a couple of months, or maybe, a year later, I was asked to share in a jail, like in a prison. Um, and I told that story, and some of the people incarcerated wanted to kick my ass and beat the shit out of me. Uh, but I felt like so I was like guilt free of telling the story, and like the individual responsible for, like kind of organizing it, was just like, "Well, you realize that, like you just said that you hurt your daughter." And I was like, "Yeah, like that's a nice story of, like kind of redemption and learning." And and he's like, "Yeah, but like this is doesn't kind of chive well in the prison." And but I completely got rid of the guilt and the shame and the, um because like the it happened, like I did it, like it was, like I was sorry for it and still am, like it's and it's so, like it's over. Same goes for, um my grandfather, asking, because he was, like he was a all of the deviances on my mother's side, like like there's some messed up people, there's, let's say there's some fucked up branches in that tree, like, so let's say it that way. Um, And so um, I have no, how can I say it? Like I have very little shame. Well, no shame and no guilt in saying that, like my grandfather, from what I remember, most probably was close to incest on me. Um, but it's not too clear because like I because I shared and talked about it, but like my memory just said, you know what, fuck off, like it's like you're okay, like your sexuality is balanced and everything's fine, like you don't have, um, and so I can talk about it, like my grandfather was most probably like a messed up, um, yeah, like messed up individual, and so like that's why like when I hear that like you need to be careful how you share and how you kind of dedust like some of your early traumas. I find this super important, super important.
Yeah.
There
I
was a long
mean,
rant, sorry about that, Aaron.
no, no, that was good. No, that was wonderful. I'm glad you shared that. No, I'm not against talking about the things as long as it's productive, you know? It's I happen to create an anxiety disorder out of talking about my trauma, but that's not how everybody does it. Some people do it differently. Some people get depressed, some people are suicidal, some people are have addictions. We all have addictions, FYI. You know, the
Yeah,
easy ones to point out are drugs and alcohol because, we're not, it alters our behavior to an extent.
and
But
kills you much faster. It
yeah,
just
and it
kills you
has,
much faster,
yeah, has detrimental effects on your body. But so do all the other things, and the other things look like, anxiety, stress, overwhelm, shopping, gambling. Sorry.
dog does not agree, just saying.
And then the other thing I think is so huge that people are addicted to now is being super busy. I can't tell you how many people I hear, oh, I'm so busy, I can't do this. Oh, I'm so busy, I can't do that. And, overscheduling themselves or overscheduling their kids or being helicopter parents, where you're just like all in your kids' business all the time. And that's your life versus you having a life. Like these are all addictions. The difference is that, with drugs and alcohol and gambling, and you have this other thing. But beneath all of those addictions is the same thing. It is unresolved trauma. There's no getting
Yeah,
around it. It's just that some people pick up drugs and alcohol, some people are super busy and, are after, other things, making a whole lot of money, or, they're fixated on these other things, but they're all addictions. If you're whatever it is that
intoxicated
you're
by your
doing,
schedule. Yeah.
yeah, whatever you're doing to not feel feelings, that's an addiction. Binge watching TV, social media. I mean, all these things we're constantly trying not to feel. And it just
Yeah.
shows up in these other ways. We call them these other things, but ultimately it all distills down to un acknowledged trauma and a way to heal it. That's it. I almost feel like sometimes it's easier when, no offense, when there is a drug or an alcohol to sort of blame, 'cause it's like, oh, I'm in recovery of this thing, but actually we're all in recovery of ourselves, our experiences, and,
Absolutely.
and they're all painful. There's no better than other, just like stories. There's no like my story is way worse than yours. No, it's as humans we take the story in and it doesn't feel good, so it doesn't matter, it's not level of feel good or bad, it's just it doesn't feel good, and there's healing that needs to take place there.
Where
So
can people find you, Aaron?
I there's two places I would say is the best place to find me. One is Instagram at Erin, ErinMacLLC. I post stories every day. I post videos once a week that are usually strategies, things to think about, notices to kind of look at in your own life. And then the other place is my website. It's Erin, ERIN-MAC.com. And there's blog posts and interviews, podcasts, information about coaching services, classes, that sort of thing.
You said you had your own podcast. What is the podcast name?
Oh, I don't have my own podcast. Just I post podcasts that I've been on.
Okay. Because I thought I heard that like um, you had a podcast. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks for being part of my journey, Erin. Like you again. Like one of the 160 angles that like another guest provided, and like you're part of that. This is an humbling and fulfilling experience for me, and I still can't believe that like a stranger named Aaron's ends up in my inbox telling me that they want to be part of it. Like it's just freaking like it fills me with gratitude, and just am happy that like you joined in. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's totally been my pleasure. I get an immense amount of joy helping people recognize that they're beautiful humans that have had a not so great experience most of the time, and if I can provide hope or guidance or strategy or anything to look at this life in a way that you can enjoy it, then that fills me up. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks to you. Take care.
You too.
Bye bye.